I do a lot of things for the State Department. I'm in charge of all the standards, both the tested and the non-tested. I'm in charge of all the assessments. I'm in charge of the career and technical education areas. We also do evaluation and we do research. So it's a number of things, and I've been really involved with the Common Core Standards movement over the last couple of years. I'm involved with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium that Kansas is a governing state in. So what I'm getting around to saying is, I'm going to talk about the waiver, but if you have questions about something else, just let me know. I'd be glad to talk about anything. I don't mind going off script, because I actually have a script they gave me. I don't know if they didn't trust me or maybe they're just trying to everybody, but they have a PowerPoint. That they said, here, do this, and stay with it. The waiver, so that's just anytime you have a question, and I'll try to have some time at the end for questions too, that if you have any that you want to talk about, I'd be glad to give you as much information as I have. I just want to say about the in-service you're going to do tomorrow with habits of mind. I think that's really important. I think this is an opportunity. Sometimes at least I always looked at change as a way of kind of like this too shall pass was kind of an attitude that I guess I had sometimes, and I think it's the wrong attitude, especially now when I think there's some real opportunities for teachers to move forward in a way that we haven't been able to before. There's some things coming together, and I think this. If those of you that don't know what the habits of mind, when you see them tomorrow, you'll see what I mean. It's a different way to look at what we're doing, our jobs, how we're approaching kids. And actually, that's the same thing with the waiver here. The waiver is an opportunity for us. I don't know how long it'll last, because I assume there'll be an election. But we're thinking after the election that there'll be a reauthorization of ESEA. And we don't quite know what we'll get. But between then and now, what we hope to do is establish enough of enough support in Kansas that we can take advantage of flexibility the federal government might allow us to do something that I think is different than what we've been doing in the past, and better for kids and for teachers. One of the problems and I'll go through this a little bit as I go through all these, one of the problems that I've always had with No Child Left Behind was not the fact that there was accountability. What I always had a problem with was that I was being judged based upon a single number. And I never thought it did a good job of describing what a school was. Just whether or not you had these kids making AYP or not. I always thought that was very unfair because it was reductionary. It limited professional expression as a teacher. And by that I mean it limited what people saw that I did. Because I've always seen teaching as kind of an art. I know you use technology and you use science and you use a lot of things, but putting them all together, it's such a tremendous balancing act. And I always, of course here I can kind of sing to the choir, but anybody if you've never been in the classroom, if you've never done that all day long for a year, you have no idea what's really going on. And NCLB and AYP, I think, suppressed our ability to fully function as artists, as educators, as professionals in the classroom. And I know I'm kind of giving you a little bit of a song and dance about this, but when I show this waiver, I think there's a real opportunity for us to make a change. And so one of the things I'm preaching every time I go out about this is not AYP, it's not NCLB, it's not No Child Left Behind, it's different. And everybody goes, yeah, I get that. No, wait a minute. Remember, some of you don't know it, you've never experienced what it was like before. Some of you are old enough, like me, to remember. But others of you have been in the field, and either this was happening or we were preparing for it. And the way we look at things, I noticed this over and over again when I talk to administrators, when I talk to teachers, when I talk to people that are involved in education. they have a very, very difficult time getting their heads out of No Child Left Behind. And I think that's a difficult thing. So this is an opportunity, and where the opportunity comes is our chance to take the new numbers that are going to come down from the assessments and from whatever, and show people how to attach significance to them. And I pick those words carefully because really, from my point of view, what we have is a set of standards, and we've got new standards, and we've got an assessment that is going to evaluate those standards. And you put those two together, and we come up with a number. Now, somebody is going to attach significance to that number. And I think that somebody should be us, rather than somebody in Washington, D.C. or something like that. And what I want to do is give you enough of a background on what the waiver is so you understand a little bit of the process. Now, the good news is it gives us a chance to have more control. Bad news is it's a little complex. So I'm going to actually skip through some of these slides. The opportunity to have a waiver was really a result of gridlock in D.C. So we took advantage of it and put one together when we had a chance. We wanted to do it because, as I said earlier, there's a narrowly defined system like NCLB. It doesn't seem to fit what we want to do. And we were already doing many parts of it anyway, so bringing different ones together kind of seemed to make sense. So, beginning, the last formation of NCLB will be this year. Remember, we're always the results that come out, and I'll be presenting those to the state board in September. Those results refer to the 2011-12 school year and the testing that went on during that. So we'll come out, there'll be one more year of AYP and all that, and then it's done. We're never doing it, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say never, but we're not going to do it for at least a couple of years at all. So there's no more of this 100% proficient by 2014. There's no more of a lot of the things that we did. There's no more Title I schools on improvement. I don't know, are any of your schools Title I schools? 3 of them. So we're not going to identify Title I schools on improvement like we have in the past at all. And there's no more those sanctions. There's no more of the sanctions that were used under NCLB. There were actually 4 principles of the waiver, but the fourth one was to reduce paperwork, and we said, well, most of what we're doing is federally required. So they said, okay, well, never mind about that one. So there are 3 of them, and I'm just going to go through each one of those. Most of the work in the waiver was really around this. But you're going to be very interested in what I have to say about this because it impacts you directly as educators. Principle 1 was about college and career-ready standards. You know, it's an interesting thing. Have any of you ever served on a standards committee? Yeah? The way we normally have done standards development in the past is we get people in the room that are educators, teachers, whatever. We get some ESL people and some special ed people and that kind of thing. And everybody decides what a kid needs to be to learn to be successful and move to the next level. And it usually kind of stops in high school, so that we think of graduation as they walk across the stage and I hand them a diploma and I'm done. And so the standards, and I don't know that anybody decided to do it that way necessarily, it's just the way and almost all states the same thing. It was this environment, this K-12 environment was how we conceptualize standards. And one of the really unique things about the Common Core standards is they did not do this. They conceptualized as what does a kid need to do to be successful in college and career. Now there's problems with that because nobody knows what that means. We're still struggling with what does it mean? As a matter of fact, even with, you say, well, college, I got that. So what's it mean to be successful in college with math? You say, well, Algebra 2 is the entry-level college credit-bearing course. I go, no, it isn't. Depends on your major. Depends on what you want to do. It might be statistics. Even in college, when I sat down with a group of college teachers, they can't pin this down. And then when it gets to careers, it gets even messier because I don't know how many of you have sent kids to college like I have, but I hoped that at the end of a college education, there was a career. And they were moving out of my basement or whatever, and they were going on to something. So this idea of, well, we don't mean careers just as, somebody goes into welding or something like that, or a 2-year degree or something like that. So it's very much individualized. And I think this is one of the real opportunities we have as teachers, because in the past we've been very much driven by kind of a group mentality around standards. We conceptualize standards like in a department, what does a kid need to know in math or in science or whatever it is, and how to graduate. We've never really thought about the kid. We've always thought about the requirement. But if you think about what does it mean to be college ready, the first thing you have to know is, well, what does the kid want? What does the student want to do? Because if we don't ask that question, we can't know if we're doing the right thing. See, it's really a huge change from just saying you're going to come in here. I've got my curriculum all designed. I've got my worksheets. I've got my textbooks. I've got, or you guys are all. Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot you have an iPad. I got my apps all ready to go. The technology can be a real advantage in helping us individualize what we're doing. But I think it's something we have to do. So I want to urge you tomorrow when you go in this to think about not how you're setting up your classroom for you, but how you're setting it up so that you can individualize it for students. And here's the reason. It's in a lot of ways, students now, what we find, and I know that it's probably not as true in Nickerson because this is where everybody's above average, and like Wobegon kind of, I know it's a great place. But in a lot of places, a lot of other places, bad places like Wichita or someplace like that. I'm kidding. I was going to say Hutchinson, but that might be a little bit too close for them. Anyway, in other places, one of the problems students have is they come to school and they power down, that it's just not relevant to them. And you say, really? Come on. But you know what? Kids really don't get it. They really don't understand that what they learn now is going to impact something later. And the reason they don't is because they don't see the connection to what they want to do in their life. And that's because we haven't connected a good education to their dreams. We haven't made that so that they're engaged in a way that they haven't been before. And maybe that didn't apply to you when you were going to school, but it applies to kids now. So what does it really mean to be college and career ready? That's a question that we have to ask almost individually for our kids. And we have to figure out how can we do that with our instruction. And I don't think it's easy. Actually, I think it's like a lot of things. It's not easy at first. But after you learn how to do it, how many of you watch the Olympics? Any of you see that? What's the gymnastics called with? You knew where I was going with it, didn't you? Did anybody see the girl throw the hula hoop up? Yeah, hula hoop. I'm going like, this is the Olympics. She threw the hula hoop up, and then she jumped in the air and did splits, and she went through the hula hoop. I was like, wow, that hurt just watching for me. I was like, I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. They played it in slow motion. I said, oh my God, you can really do that? I said, yeah. Oh my gosh, how would we individualize for kids? You know what? It can be done. It looks hard at first, but it's not. And here's how to do it. Just one piece at a time. Tomorrow, when you go through this in-service, just think about one thing you can change at a time. I used to put I'd put a a slide up, it would have 21st century classrooms and 20th century classrooms, and it'd be a whole list of things. And I tell people, just pick one and do it. And that's kind of my message as I go through this whole thing, that we can make this change, and what you're going to see with the waiver is an attempt by the State Department to support what you're doing by bringing to the accountability much more flexibility for you to move across. The other thing that was required by the waiver, by the feds, was that we had to be constructing an assessment to measure the new college and career ready standards. And we are involved with that assessment. Have you seen that? There's a YouTube video about building an airplane while you're flying it. Somebody does it as an advertisement. They're actually up there, and at the end they all parachute off it. This really applies to the assessment because they're putting it together, planning to do things that the technology to do it hasn't yet been developed. So we're kind of hopeful that the last time last time I remember somebody quoted like that was the admiral in charge of the Spanish Armada said we sail in hope of a miracle, and of course there was one, right? Okay, it's a history lesson, so okay. Anyway, we're hoping that the Smarter Balanced Assessments do everything that they claim that they're going to do in Kansas. But they will be a lot different. Number one, they'll be adaptive. So students test down, if they get a right answer and the student next to them has a wrong answer, the next question, the next set of questions will be different. There will also be a lot of performance questions. There'll be what we call technology-enhanced questions. In some cases, there might be situational judgment questions. And those technology-enhanced questions, some of them that I've seen are just awesome. Others are just, kind of computer tricks. But some of them really will get at a different kind of thing for students. So if you're one of those teachers that's been used to preparing your students for the test in a certain way, that's really going to change because it's really going to be a different kind of test. So it's just like the future. How do you prepare kids for a future that you can't see? It's different. The test will be different. The concepts will be different. What we'll be asking them to do and to show will be different. And that will all start. Actually, if I have my way, we'll start it in 2014 because that's when we're scheduled to pilot the test. And what I really don't want to do is I don't want to give the kids 2 tests. We only have to give them 1. So if we could pilot 1 test, I hope we can cut the other one out. But if not, it starts for real. We had to promise it would start in 2015. So in 2014-15, that's when the new assessments will come. People often ask me, well, so 2 more years, old assessments, new assessments, old standards, new standards, what should I focus on? And I tell almost everybody, focus on the core elements of the new Common Core standards and you'll do fine with the old assessment and the new assessment. Those students that are weak in a particular area, you need to have a way to find that out. Use some kind of interim or formative assessment and find out who's weak and then approach it individually, but focus the right direction. We're also working on new English language proficiency standards that will also be are part of the waiver. But all of that was in place anyway. We were doing all of that to begin with. Principle 2 is about a differentiated accountability program. So what it really amounts to is there's actually 6 AMOs. And 2 of them have been around for a while, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but 4 of them are new. And AMO, which means annual measurable objective. And I'm going to go through each of the 4. But what it does is it slices and dices the information in a different way so that schools that are different perform differently in these areas and they show strengths and weaknesses. And then what our intent, since we don't have to make judgments about very many of these, is to give the data out to the district, to the superintendent and the board, the principals and the teachers, and let them decide how significant those numbers are. Let them decide how they want to guide the school forward. So I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about student achievement, student growth, decreasing the gap, and reducing non-proficient. Those are the 4 AMOs that we're looking at with the waiver. The participation rates, that was a requirement that we keep that. Everybody already knows mostly about that. And graduation rates I can talk about if anybody has a question, but those have been, they were recently revised a couple of years ago, or last year, something like that. This is the kind of report card that we're talking about, and this is just for demonstration purposes. I found out the difference in that after I was called to testify in the school funding case, and some of the lawyers thought this was actual real data. It was actually kind of funny, and there's this quiet moment in the courtroom, and I said, well, those are just made-up figures, so I could show teachers what they're looking at. They moved on very quickly. So we're going to present data like this for people, and you'll be able to click in, and if you have the right authentication, you'll be able to drill down to individual student data. Now, if you're on the public side, you won't be able to see that much. You'll be able to see what the school looks like. You won't be able to see individual student. But you can see that there's no way that this is reducible to one number. There's no way that a school is going to be seen as just thumbs up, thumbs down. Each one of those performance levels has the AMO. So the first one it focuses on student achievement, but it does it in a different way than in the past. Now, you know what I mean is student achievement in the past. If you moved a kid from approaches standards to meet standards, that's good. What happens if you moved a kid from meet standards to exceed standards? What kind of credit did you get in the system then? How about, which was really hard, how about from academic warning to approaches? You got no credit for that, and it's still counted against you. Even though we all know that bringing that kid up to one step is harder than taking the kid who exceeds standards to exemplary. So we had a system that forced us to really attend only to a certain group of kids. It was designed to leave no child left behind, but in fact, it left the majority of them behind. It only focused on kids that were right around the stand. That's all you got credit for. I was talking, a couple years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who's an elementary school principal in a 100% low free and reduced lunch school. And they went from being on improvement to making standard excellence. And I asked her how she'd done it, and she was telling me about how they realigned this, and they got more efficient, and they had these kind of things for the kids that were struggling. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. What do you do? So, what do you do for the kid in October that is, passing the test already? She said, oh, we don't have time for that. I think that's the problem. And what the Academic Assessment Performance Index is designed to do is to get around that problem. So instead of, let's see if I've got an example. Instead of just write that line right there, what we're doing is giving people credit for movements across the entire values table is the technical term for this. So this is a school, it's actually a real school, with 261 students in it, and you can see how they're distributed. Now this school is doing fairly well. They have most of their students, the vast majority of them, above meet standards, and only a few. So what happens is we assign values to each one of these, and we do a little basic division, and we calculate an API for that school. So first of all, we've got it into a number, but second of all, it's much more realistic because it gives credit across the entire spectrum for people. Here's an example of what this school's performance looked like over 4 years. Looks pretty flat, doesn't it? That's figured the old way with AYP. But here's what their performance looks like with the API. And what I'm saying is this school never got that kind of credit. Teachers never got the kind of credit for the tremendous job they're doing. It looked like, pretty flat. If I was these teachers, no, I was going to say something about negotiation, but that's probably a loaded subject here. Oops. So that API, I call that achievement. So when I talk about achievement, growth, gap, and reduction of non-proficient, that's the first one. So it's based upon, it's the same kind of thing in a way of AYP, but it distributes it in a much better way across the entire range of students. The second one, and this is a requirement, is that we use a growth model. And Kansas has been working on the student growth percentile model for actually quite a while. So we were already really there. A number of states use this same model, and you can go on our website and go to the research and evaluation team, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on this growth model if you really want to know about it. Now this is very complicated, and I'm not going to talk much about it, but also if you want to see some really nice stuff on the same thing, Colorado uses this growth model. I think there's about 6 or 8 states that do it. And what's nice about this is it looks at student growth, and it compares students to other students like them. Because we know that students that are performing up here, their growth is different than students that are performing down here. That those aren't going to, if I just compare those with, that's not going to be really a really very equitable way to look at student growth. So what we do is we look at student growth over time, but we compare the students to students similar to them. Now what you want to pay attention to about this is going to be really important in the teacher evaluation model. Because in the teacher evaluation model, the feds are requiring that growth be a significant part. And there's a lot of questions that come up about that, but this element is a big one. We have schools, once again, not here in Nickerson, but we have schools, actually the school I went to, my high school, when testing first started, their achievement in math was in single digits. You think about that for a minute. Less than 10% of their kids were proficient on the math assessment. It did actually a little bit. Now they have 68% or something like that. I mean, that's a big wow. They went from 60 points, but they're still not making AYP, right? Because the target's higher. That we see that as a fundamental inequity in the current reporting system. And so there's some schools, I call it, depends on the audience I'm in, I'll call it the beer can effect, or this might be a kind of a beer can audience, but can anybody actually crush a beer can on their head? I got anybody in here that? Well, the first half of it's pretty easy to crush, but to go from half to a quarter is pretty hard, and to go from a quarter to, you need a hydraulic press at that point. Well, that's the same thing with growth. For some schools, they're not going to show a lot of growth because they're already doing so well. So if you just have a growth model, those schools are penalized. But some schools are doing tremendous amount of growth. And if you just have a performance model with a single goal, they never get credit for it. So having these multiple AMOs, what a different picture for a school. That's what I was getting at before. One number just doesn't do it. You need more. So for those schools, your AMO is simply, there's the mean, and your AMO is to be on that side. That's it. This is a really interesting one. How many of you know whether or not, I'll use last year's numbers because this year's numbers aren't out. Did the district make AYP? They don't know. Here's something that has always troubled me. We use subgroups and we identify kids, and you hang a big label on them. And you say, you're African American, you're disabled, you're low SES, you're not an English language speaker. We look at a subgroup. But what do we really care about in each one of those subgroups? What we really care about is how they're performing. And so what we decided to do was forget about the labels and just look at the lowest performing kids as a subgroup themselves. And look at the state average for performance among 70% of the schools, and that's the gap. So now, a lot of schools in the past didn't have a subgroup because they didn't have quite enough kids in any one category. And in some cases, that wasn't good for those kids. Now, everybody's got a lowest 30%. And it's actually not that hard to figure. We've got a little worksheet out there that you can. So every one of your schools will have a lowest 30% that you can look at and you can judge. Now, the AMO for that, remember, we're done with 100% because remember, 100% is kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, statistically, everybody knows that, but politically, it's a hard thing to say. Anyway, the AMO for that is to take your gap and reduce it in half in 6 years. So whatever your gap is. So two things about that you may not have picked up on right away. Number one, the gap for one high school is not the same as another, the AMO. The AMO for the elementary schools, 2 elementary schools, is not the same. It's based upon that individual school's performance with their students. So it's individualized for them. So we're looking at all of these AMOs are individualized for the building. So just like I was talking a little bit about figuring out how to teach, it only makes sense if we're also going to do the same thing for accountability. If we're going to look at some kind of way that we can make accountability for you fit you and different for the next school over. So you take the lowest 30% of your students and you take the state average high, and there's a gap in there, divide it in 12ths, and you've got, however you want to do the math, and half in 6 years. And that's a reduction in gap. Now, you want to pay attention to that because here's an example. So let's say your Board of Education gets all this information back. What are they going to do with it? They get to decide. They look at each school and they can say, well, let's see, we've got information on the API. We know how students are progressing across the entire range. We've got growth. We can look at our growth. We can look at our lowest performing students, how they match up. What do we want to do? Where do we want to put our efforts? Where do we want to focus school improvement for us? Maybe it's gap. Maybe it's growth. Maybe it's student achievement. But it now becomes a local decision. Oh, yeah, I should have gone to that. So there's a state benchmark, and then it's an individual school is at the bottom. So, and there's how it would look for it. See, remember, that's just half of the gap. I was talking to somebody, I think it was in Renwick, and I asked them how many non-proficient students they had. 7. It was the high school, I think. 7. And we were talking about this AMO, reducing the non-proficient students in half in 6 years. I said, okay, so at 7, we can't cut kids in half, but, you know, half of 7, and you say it's 4 over 6 years. It's not even a student a year. And the superintendent said, well, that won't matter because we're going to get all of them. And that's the right attitude. But for somebody who's not making any progress, this is a way to look at how do we get those students that are non-proficient to be proficient. So your board might say, that's where we want to focus our effort. So what we've given is now 4 ways to look at the data to make decisions about, make strategic decisions about how they want to move forward. And I think this is significant because it forces everybody to have a, hopefully, I do my English teacher quotes, hopefully an intelligent conversation around data. Before, you just got an AYP score, and somebody said, how did we do? You said, well, we made it. Great. I got the champagne, I guess. But you don't have any kind of conversation around it. Unless, and I know probably as a school district or as teachers in service, you were doing a little bit more with that because you can with the kind of reports. But now the Hutch News will now have to be forced to look at this with a much more open eye about what does it mean about each school? Where are their strengths? What are their challenges? And I'm hoping that gives a much better conversation around accountability. Because one of the criticisms that we received at the State Department about this is that we were punting on accountability. That the waiver was going to make schools not accountable anymore. And obviously it's not true in a certain sense. It's more accountability. It's just better. It doesn't have the inequities of the other. There's the state. We will continue to report out the information that we have before. So we'll continue to report out subgroup information. But you don't have to make AYP based upon that. You may not have ever seen one of these, but we look at them all the time. The AYP summary report, we call it. And there's 42 cells. And you have to have a yes in every one of them to make it. Now that's all wiped away because that kind of a system is going to be replaced by a compensatory system, where if you make it in any one of if you make any one of your AMOs, they'll be considered making. If you're a title school, I know some of you are. If you're not a title school, it's just information. There's no more AYP list at all. If you are a title school, you get the information, and if you don't make some progress, you have to fill out a plan with the state. The participation rate I mentioned is already graduation goals. How I feel sometimes. We still have the same graduation goals for secondary students that were changed a couple of years ago. Okay, so what I just did, that was the first half of Principle 2. Whew. You all right? See, if I wanted to harass you, I'd make you all stand up now and do something. No. Sounds like a good, doesn't it? Yeah. The other half of Principle 2 concerns what's going to happen to title schools. So there's 3 things that happen to title schools. 5% of the schools in the state are going to become priority schools, identified as priority schools. Now this is a problem because it's a percentage, right? 5%. If I take 5% of the people in this room, no matter how many people are in the room, it's always going to be some, right? So what I don't like about 5% of priority schools in the state is it doesn't matter how well schools perform, there's always going to be 30-some schools picked. So priority schools, a list will come out, probably tomorrow at the board meeting. There'll be a list of priority schools, and Title I dollars that were used in the past for school improvement will be focused on priority schools. Secondly, there'll be focus schools. Focus schools will be, priority schools are schools with the lowest achievement. We use that API thing I showed you up here. So schools with the lowest API in the state, they're priority schools. Remember the gap? Reduction in gap? Focus schools are the schools with the largest gap in the state. So those schools also get another level of responsibility under the new waiver. And then finally, there's some 10% of the just title schools are picked as rewards. So we look at the API again and the growth, and we pick the top 10% of the schools of the state. So what we had before was a series of listed as schools on improvement, and probably some of you know this if you're a title school. You had 7 levels that you progress through various things if you're a Title I school not making it. Okay, so there are 66, 33 priority schools and 66 or so focus schools, and those are the schools that are targeted for more intensive improvement and federal dollars. And here are the turnaround principles that are going to be applied to those schools. And remember, if you're a title school and you're not a priority or focus school, then these aren't your responsibility anymore. Strong leadership, ensure teacher effectiveness, redesign school day and week or year. This is what we'll be asking priority schools to do. Strengthen the instructional program. Using data, establish an environment that improves safety and discipline. And community engagement. Actually, all good things. Really. And a lot of schools will probably choose to do this as a part of what they do. So the focus schools, 2 years of data, largest gap, and once again we're going to be using the KLN was the Kansas Learning Network to help provide assistance to those schools. To be on improvement, not on improvement, I shouldn't say, to be not making progress, NMP, not making progress, you have to miss all of your objectives. And if that happens to you, then you have to have a plan about how you're going to do better. That's the new accountability that replaced NCLB. And remember I said it when I started out? Good news is it's a much more articulated way to look at what happens to schools, the data and everything about them, but it's more complicated. And it is, isn't it? It's more complex. There's a lot of moving pieces to it. Okay. Teacher evaluation is a whole other element. And I'm going to go through it a little bit, but it's in flux right now. One of the biggest challenges we had, one of the biggest holdups in working with the federal government was they wanted us to implement the teacher evaluation plan right now. They wanted us to do it immediately, and we wanted to wait at least a year to pilot the program. So finally we gave in on some things and they gave in on that. So there are a few schools in Kansas now that have piloted the current version of KEEP, and we've made some changes to it, modifications, and now we're going to be bringing it out for a larger pilot and trying to set up the pilot so that we can look at the data from schools and try to do something that makes sense rather than just reacting to what seems like a good idea at the time. So I really want to encourage all of you to participate as much as you can in understanding and knowing what the new teacher evaluation system is and how to help us design one that's as good as it can possibly be. There's a lot of information. If you go on the teacher licensure page, you can look at the whole thing. There are a number of different elements to it. It's not just student achievement, which I think is a really good thing. It also includes the opportunity for teachers to provide their own input into it. And it might be locally driven assessments. It might be, has anybody done the National Teacher Certification? Anybody in here? To do it, you kind of collect a portfolio. It's like a box of evidence that shows how you work, how you have done something as a teacher. That's a little bit what this is like. So these are the basic elements. Here's the thing about it, is you don't have to use the state plan. You can have your own if you want. But it has to have the same elements. It has to have these elements in it. The state plan is a fairly sophisticated way to look at everything from how your students are doing to what kind of engagement they have in class to all different aspects of I guess what I would call a whole teacher. So if you want to design your own plan, more power to you, but look at this one because it'll give you a lot of heads up about what the kind of things you need in it. That's basically what I just said. So there's the timeline for the teacher evaluation. We plan on working through, we have to define what student growth and what percent. The feds have just said it has to be significant. In some states, they've defined that as 50% or more. The plan, we're trying to go with a lower number. Those of you that assign letter grades in your class, you know that 50% is not necessary to be significant. A much smaller percent is significant for most students. Actually, I would argue it's as low as 10%. To those students that care about grades, then 10% is enough to make them care. But I'm having trouble with convincing the federal government that that's actually. So probably somewhere between 30, we're shooting for around 30% on it. And then we'll have some final decisions. There's a commission looking at all of these things. They'll decide where the cut points are and that kind of thing. And then the board will make some final decisions. So 13, 14, this year we're piloting them, and then the next year in 14 we'll probably pilot a revised instrument. So if you have an opportunity, you might want to think about volunteering for a pilot and seeing how it works, because it would be low stakes. You could look at your data, and you could see how it goes before full implementation in 14, 15. One of the reasons we almost didn't go for the waiver because of the teacher evaluation portion. We knew we didn't want to do anything until 14, 15. And we weren't sure how we wanted to even approach teacher evaluation. But two things were important. One is the waiver gave us a chance to stop the madness with AYP at a very critical time for schools, when a lot of other things are changing. If we hadn't done something with it, then when the smarter balanced assessments and new Common Core standards come in, you would see a 30 to 40% drop in proficiency among your students. So all of a sudden, without the public really understanding why, you look a lot worse. Unless we do something with it, which we did, then it was a potential crisis for schools. Second thing is, everybody that's kind of plugged into what's going on in Washington with the reauthorization of ESEA has made it clear that teacher evaluation is going to be part of the new law. This gives us a chance to construct a Kansas version of something, and it'll do one of either two things. Either it will prepare us for the inevitable comes down, or we can make a good enough case that we've got a system, we built it like you said to build it, it's working, don't mess it up. So I realize that sounds like, you mean, wait, you're kind of gambling? Yes. We're hoping that we can talk sense into people. Like maybe that's, I know during election year it's not possible, but anyway. So this is a very big part of the waiver. It will be functionally invisible to people for a couple of years, but don't let this fly into your radar, because I'm not sure there's anything more important here than what we use and how we go about judging teachers. I'm very nervous about this. for a number of reasons, and I touched on them, some of them at the beginning of when I started talking. I don't think many people really understand what it means to teach. Was it Christy McKyle, the woman that went up on the shuttle? She said, "I touch the future, I teach." I think that crystallizes something that you don't see in an accountability system. And I think we've all had, well, some of you are just youngsters, but those of us that have been around for a while, we've all had kids come to us and say something very kind, very important to us about us as teachers. And when you know that you have changed a person's life, I mean, how do you put a number on that? See, I just don't know. I'm very nervous about this. So whenever I go out and talk to people, I say, please get involved. Don't just let this happen as if it's a change. I really don't think it's going away. I really think whoever's in the White House, that when they reauthorize ESEA, that teacher evaluations will be part of the blueprint. Next steps. If people like me, although you guys didn't luck out because everybody else that does this is a lot funnier and more interesting than me. But we're going out and talking to groups. We've got webinars, and if you get a chance to watch the webinar, by the way, I think her reaction, Commissioner's sitting 2 people away from me, and I started to tell it, one of those walks into a bar's joke. And I said, a commissioner of education, a rabbi, and a polar bear walk into a bar. And I really had no intention of telling the rest of the joke, which, well, as my wife says, I don't know why you think you're funny, but I think it's funny. But anyway, I wasn't going to tell, but just the look on her face is like, it was just when the camera started, she's like, if you happen to, if your life is so pathetic that at some point at like 3 a.m. and you say, more wine? No, I'll go on the KSDE website and I'll watch a webinar on the waiver. You can take a look, tell me what you think. Anyway, so we have, probably the best thing is we'll have some of these fact sheets, and we'll be coming out with a lot of other talking points and things like that. And here's what I want to say. You have a lot of power in your community. If you can carry this message to people, there's a new way to look at schools that's not just about AYP. I think that's an important thing that you need to start having a conversation when you get the opportunity. So here's what we say to people. We're focused on Common Core. We're developing the next generation of assessments. We're designing a new accreditation system. We're going to design an accreditation system that is so much different than what we have now that it would take me another hour. No, I'm kidding. To talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it now. But, we are designing a new accreditation system that will be remarkably different because it will give, we're really going to focus on a number of issues. We'll still do results so that kids that are learning. But one of the things we found out, if you look at, there's a lot of talk now about making Kansas competitive or making the United States competitive in a global whatever. And they use these international assessments to rank, and you see these charts where the United States is here, and all these, they're in the kind of the middle or they're decreasing. I tell people, I said, yeah, forget that. They look at me like, I said, you know what? Taking tests isn't really what we do well. Things like the Olympics. We do that better. Aren't you glad there wasn't a standardized achievement test gold medal in the Olympics? It would have been less interesting than rhythmic gymnastics, right? Really, America that's not what we are. That's not we don't have a compliant culture where kids learn the information, they sit down, and they do it. We do to some extent. We love kids that are rule followers, right? But a lot of you weren't. A lot of you were trouble, actually, when you were growing up. And now you're great teachers. And we also have people who are innovators and people who are creative. In the United States, that's what we're known for. And that's what we should be valuing in our schools. The ability of a school, like a school district like this one, who is interested in taking new technology and taking it to the students. That's the kind of thing that we should be giving credit for in the accreditation system, and not just how did kids do on a multiple choice test. So we're designing that system right there to do that. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but it's also going to fit together with the waiver. So really, all of these parts and pieces are interlocking at some level. And then prepare for the future. Yeah, I already said that. Questions? Usually, I don't know how many of you have ever done this, but probably none of you. But you ever had a student fall asleep in class? Well, when they put their head down, that's sort of a discipline problem. But sometimes they'll be sitting there, and like you can see their eyes, and they just kind of roll back in their heads. And you know, you realize they're actually in a trance-like state. They've fallen asleep, but their body hasn't relaxed. Man, you've got them right there. And that's the peak. And at that point, you can say, "Are there any questions?" And they don't. I probably talked you all into that state. But if you have questions about any of this, yes, sir.
Back to the teacher evaluation piece. I hate to ask a dumb question, but I've never stopped you before. What specifically do you do, or does the system use to follow student achievement? For example, a teacher that's a non-traditional teacher. Let's say you have a library media specialist who doesn't actually grade students, or someone like that. How do you do that?
There's a couple of ways. One is that we're asking teachers that are like that, and it turns out that that's the majority. In studies that they've done around this idea, between 16 and 32% of the teachers can be directly linked to achievement scores. It kind of depends on how departmentalized your elementary school is or something like that. So depending on the structure of the schools in the district, 16 to 30, so it leaves 70% or more of your teachers that can't be directly linked. So one of the things we're doing is pulling teachers and asking, what part of your instruction what part of the assessment would you say your instruction impacts? And we're asking 4%. And so polling, and to find out that if I'm a science teacher, then I might say, well, I actually do a lot of math. And so I think some, and then the teachers can give it as a whole group some percent for ability, and then that percent can be articulated out to individual teachers. That's one way. Another way that we're trying to do it is by redefining what student achievement means. It's not just the same assessment. So, for example, is my ag teacher here? You don't have any? Do you have some current tech ed teachers? Well, we're starting with that. But we're creating end-of-pathway assessments. So those of you that are current tech ed teachers know what I'm talking about. Well, that's an assessment that targets what you teach. And so we're saying, why not use that? And so in some cases, the district has district tests. Here's a problem. And I'm a lonely voice about this in some ways. But a lot of people look at the formative assessments that you give, or the interim assessments, or you give math. You use math here? You give your own. And then you give that to students, and you take it and you examine it, and you say, why not use those? Because those are more fair to me. And I go, yeah, but here's what happens. As soon as you start using that assessment to evaluate people, it changes the assessment. Right? It's just like if a guy gives you flowers and then you find out there's a reason. Your husband. course, you're suspicious right away if you get your flower dry. But it changes the intent of what's going on. And if you take a formative assessment, which is a process anyway, and you make it evaluative of the instructor, it changes the game, and then you lose that. So it's very tricky. But the instrument, actually, there's several other ways. They're using the class, which is a nationally recognized, and it's evaluation that requires an observer input. So there's several opportunities like that, and we can track, we can create a number around those, track it over time, and use it as growth. And we're hoping that the Fed will accept that as a significant element of student growth in our system. What else? Yes, ma'am.
As we're implementing these new evaluation procedures, what happens to the schools that were put on like disciplinary sanctions for not making KYP and stuff? Is that just forgiven, or is
It's gone. So it's done.
So all this, we've had our feet held to the fire for all these years now, is irrelevant?
Yes, although the last time I had my feet held to the fire, it felt pretty good not to be held to the fire anymore. So
Right, but
yeah,
I'm saying that
hopefully,
a lot of time and energy and money was spent to reach these goals.
well, hopefully they were school improvement goals and your school improved.
Right.
So hopefully it wasn't a wasted.
But no, but I was
Yeah.
asking about the people that didn't reach it, that, you know, that they were, had some remedial thing, but now that won't happen?
Right. Actually, a lot of those, if those people didn't improve, a good example would be my old alma mater. They did improve, so they're not part of the new system. They're not a focus or a priority school. But for the Title I schools that were on improvement that didn't improve, they're probably identified again as one of the lower performing schools, because they would have been low performing anyway. They would have been identified.
I guess my question was that, is there going to be then a year gap, and because there's not follow-up from the year before, and when these new procedures are implemented, is there going to be a year's gap when we're not really going to know the effectiveness of the remediation thing?
There will be no gap at all for all the other schools in the state. The 98 schools or so that are on the priority and the focus, they will be on the list. The list is not new every year. Probably should have mentioned this. Once they're identified, you're on the list. It's a 3-year list. There's a way to get off, but nobody's going to be adding. So if you're not on the list, you're not on. So what we wanted to do was take there's 33 priority schools. So we wanted to take them, the ones that were most in need, and work with those first, and then start down. And the Feds told us no. We have to do it all of them at once. So yeah, it's kind of nutty.
That's my point.
Yeah.
But that had been highlighted now aren't going to receive the same attention that they would have.
Yes, if you were, schools that were in the KLN network may not be in there, and they may be getting assistance. Now, if you're a title school and you have title funds, you'll still get that.
This is Dr.
Oh yeah, please. It might be perhaps so really boring, actually. That
This new teacher evaluation that Dan Brownback is working on, explain that a little bit. You're kind of starting to bubble about it. I'm not sure all the years
Well, sometimes we work with the governor's office on these things. And so the pilot that I point out there is being funded in the legislature. So at least initially we're working together. So most of the components. If you want to understand what Brownback's administration sees for school improvement, for educational policy in general, you look at Florida. And so the camera's still rolling, so I'll just say, look at Florida. And that's generally what they have.
I have another question about the 1%, 2% special ed. area, we had those limits before, you got reclassified as students of vision. Does that still stand?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of questions about things like that.
So no more modified assessment?
There won't be any more CAM, modified assessments, because the new assessments will be adapted. And we think it's a better system, because you'll be able to go off grade level with a student pretty easily. Now, alternate assessments, there's still be, we're in a different consortium. It's a really cool, how many SPED teachers are here now? Know this SPED? It's a really awesome assessment that we're working, it's entirely different. But it uses a dynamic learning map for assessing standards. It's really, I think it's, we're talking about the next generation assessments with Smarter Mouse. That one's the generation after. We'll get to it for everybody because it gets different ways around. A lot of those decisions about reclassification, I never liked reclassification, so it's very awkward and funky and it's in a bad way. So I'm asking that we discontinue it. And there's a whole set of policy decisions that, like confidence intervals, there's no safe harbor anymore, but we can still put confidence intervals around the AMOs if we want to. And it was just a lot. It just makes it even more complex. What I want to do is, as I said before, I just want to give the data out to the districts, and then you guys, you tell yourself. But here's an example of what I mean. Let's say you don't make your AMO. Some school, say the high school doesn't make their AMO for student achievement, and it's presented to the board, and the board says, "Well, what's up with that?" And the principal says, "Yeah, here's why that is." The board goes, "Okay, we understand. That's pretty reasonable." That's something that can happen at the local level. But see, it can't even happen at the state, much less the federal level. It just has to be, you made it, you didn't make it. So that's what I mean. I want to stop making decisions for other people, which is what we did 42 times on the A1P. Really? You don't have any hard questions? Yes. Yes.
If I'm understanding you correctly, we should volunteer to be a pilot school 13, 14, or start it.
I'd say yes. I mean, I don't know all of what there is involved. Look at it this way. I take a serious look at it to see if it's something that is a good thing for you. It's coming, so what you might do is you might look, well, what system do we currently have in place? How does that work with our walkthroughs and all of that? And what pieces can we, and maybe you can, make your own, which is fine. Or maybe you'd rather have a ready-made one. But in any case, take a look at it and do a little bit of a pilot. You can do it in one school. You could have a lottery. It'd be like the short story lottery. It's the old English teacher. And that when they stone people to death. Okay. Yeah, there's another question? Algorithmic gymnastics back there? Something about standards, Common Core standards. Science standards are coming.
Yes, they are. How soon?
The draft standards are supposed to be out anytime.
Okay.
Because they're, I just don't think they've gone public with the draft. I'm trying to remember. It was supposed to be August 1st or something, and it's been delayed a couple of weeks. But those of you that teach science, which is everybody in elementary, right, and science teachers, the new science standards are a dramatic change from what we've done in the past. Very big difference. New history government standards and social studies standards are being worked on now. New standards for ants. We have standards for everything. We have standards. Any other questions? New assessments? They say that the fall is, that looked hard to me, but the hula, I've never been able to do that. I could never get this hula hoop down. It just went. We had a Hulu contest for work, and they said, not you. Any other questions? One more. Okay. I want to thank you all. I really, I know I've kind of made light of a few things, but I won't make light of this. I really do believe that education is all about teachers. In research, we know that if a child has 2 or 3 bad teachers in a row, they never recover. We also know if they have 2 or 3 good teachers in a row, that they can make remarkable gains by over a standard deviation. So we all know how important teachers are. And I just want, whenever I have an opportunity to talk to group of teachers, I never want to miss the chance to just say thank you for everything you do, because it really does make a difference to kids. And we know, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I still want to say thanks for letting me be here, thanks for paying attention, and let me know if you have any questions.